Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Springfield City Club. I'm Len Goodwin, Club Secretary, and I'm happy to introduce the program for today. Before I introduce the program, however, I'd like to remind you that there is always an opportunity to join Springfield City Club. We welcome new members. In fact, we're even looking people who are willing to volunteer for participation on our board of directors. There are membership application forms on your table if you choose, or you can also do it on the website. Today's program, it will be another one of those dull and boring programs that will be of interest only to people who vote. And I hope that includes everyone here. As I'm sure all of you know, an initiative petition was filed, qualified for the ballot, measure 118. What that measure does is create an additional tax, and I'm sure you will hear more details about the nature of the tax that applies to sales above $25 million. It provides also that if that tax is enacted, the revenue collected will be distributed to residents of the state of Oregon who have resided here for more than 200 days. Today we have two people to speak about the proposition. And Antonio Gisbert is the chief petitioner for what is called the Oregon Rebate Program. He organized a diverse group of community members to codify into a statewide ballot initiative a partial response to the sort of widely held belief that it's difficult to make a living or provide for yourselves in Oregon, and that, as he puts it in his bio, giant corporations are supposedly not paying their fair share. That effort gathered over 170,000 signatures to qualify for the November election, and this is what we're talking about today. Prior to working on ballot measure 118, he was a cognitive neuroscientist, and he can explain to you what that is, because I certainly can't, and a union organizer. I can explain that. Speaking in opposition to measure 118 is Preston Mann. Preston is the Director of Political Affairs for Oregon Business and Industry, which is the state's largest general business association. At OBI, he is responsible for the organization's political strategy and external affairs. He has many years of experience in policy advocacy, communications, public relations, and political strategy. Prior to joining OBI, he served as vice president of a manufacturing trade association and worked as a senior advisor to statewide political candidates and causes, as well as dozens of legislative elections. We're going to follow a fairly simple format today. Now, normally in election-related things, we flip a coin to see who goes first. We're not doing that today because as a ballot measure, it's probably more important that you understand what it is and then understand why we should or should not support it. For that reason, Antonio will go first and then Preston will follow. Antonio will have roughly 15 minutes, 10 minutes or so to make his case. Preston will have the same amount of time to make his case. That will be followed by Antonio returning for 5 more minutes and then Preston for another 5 minutes. That takes us to about 30 minutes, 12:30, close to that. And after that, we'll open the floor to questions. We do have an audience on Zoom. They will be permitted to ask questions, and Paige, our president, will be monitoring the Zoom feed and help us facilitate the questions. With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Antonio for an opportunity to explain measure 118.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not used to hearing applause when I stand up, so that's cool. Thank you. As I said, my name is Antonio Gisbert. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the chief petitioner of measure 118, which is also known as the Oregon Rebate. Before I get into it, I want to just touch briefly on the Oregon system of direct democracy. And generally speaking, there's 3 ways that we put measures on the ballot. First and foremost, the legislature refers things for voters to vote on. in the case where they cannot pass a law, or where they perhaps don't have the courage to pass such a law. The second way to get something on the ballot in Oregon is when either when well-funded corporations or community organizations sort of get together and put something on the ballot. There's tons of examples of that, I'm sure. You can think of a few. And then the third way is sort of what we like to think of as like the true direct democracy way, which is when regular people like you and I meet together to try to imagine an organ that works better for us. Obviously, we all have different ideas of what's better than worse. But I think that differentiating these three is really important. And I want to like point out and I want to say explicitly that the Oregon Rebate or Mission 118 is this third type of ballot initiative. The way we started off was back in 2018, 2019, when myself and another friend had this idea that at the time we didn't think it was that radical. And the idea was that wouldn't it be great if giant corporations paid a little bit more taxes, and then we use that money to directly improve the lives of every single Oregonian. That's really what we're talking about with Mission 118. That's all it is. It's just 4 pages of text. I brought a bunch of copies of it. They're back there. Hopefully, like you grab one or either before or on your way out. And it's really important to keep in mind that like I'm not a candidate. This is not a thing about me. What we're talking today about is an idea that we expressed in 4 pages of proposed legislation, right? Back in 2018, I happened to be a proud resident of Springfield, lived up on our street there. I was renting a quadplex. And I organized about a dozen friends to start meeting regularly to try to like fill in the details of of how to do this. How do we improve our lives here in Oregon through the ballot initiative process? Importantly, 12 folks that I'm talking about, more or less, the process took about 8 months to do, meeting on weekends, generally in like coffee shops and community spaces. Did you all know Theo's Coffee over in Eugene? Okay, that was kind of like unofficial HQ every other Saturday. It's really kind of amazing that from such a humble beginning, this like super diverse group of folks, we have a Republican in the room, Democrat in the room, and everybody in between. It's kind of amazing that after 8 months of organizing, we were able to start chipping away at a ballot initiative that ended up in the ballot with 170,000 collected signatures. That's like, if anybody here does any community activism or organizing work, like, you know how hard that is, and we're super proud of that. Of course, there was a global pandemic between 2018 and today that did delay us. The first time that we filed the Oregon rebate was for the 2020 election cycle. We got permission to collect signatures about a week before the governor shut the state down. Those were the scary days of COVID, right? We were like wiping out groceries and whatnot. We refiled for 2022, and we couldn't get, we were just waiting for the pandemic to end, not just for our work, but also for like the well-being of everybody else, of course. We didn't make it in 2022, and so third time's the charm. We managed to qualify the ballot now. Another thing that 2022 cycle was really important because while we were all like sequestered indoors, right? We were able to like really up a fundraising game, and that is actually like a big part of this success strategy of the campaign. So I'm sure you're gonna hear about the fact that we were successful in raising about $750,000 to get on the ballot, which is amazing. I'm super proud of that. Yeah, the bulk of that money comes from folks who are outside of Oregon, but that's totally fine. critical point is that you can go back to the text from 2020 and the text now, that's Measure 118, and you'll see that almost nothing has changed. Just dates, a few numbers here and there, but the core concept is the same. And we are really proud of the fact that as a super people-powered, small, like, project, that we've been able to grow this far, right? Not only is like fundraising that kind of money, like pretty impressive, but also 170,000 signatures, I think goes a long way. So that's how we got here. And so what does the Oregon rebate, well, forgive me. Sorry, I lost my track, my point. The two motivating ideas that that group of 12 have are that particularly the biggest corporations are not paying their fair share in taxes in the state of Oregon. And we have a minimum corporate tax, the minimum corporate tax rate after $25 million is less than 0.12%. That to us, in absolutely inherent, felt like it was just something that was like unfair. When we as regular folks pay between 4.75 and 9.9% in taxes, a corporation that makes more than $25 million, surely ought to pay more than 0.12%. We sort of held that truth to be sort of self-evident, if you will. Then another thing that we all felt, because we're just regular people, is that we all felt the pressure of making ends meet. This is a problem today, but I'll assure you that we felt the same way in 2018, and it's really been a problem that's been sort of persistent in like modern American history, right? There's various ways of talking about it, like the hollowing out of the middle class. You may have heard that expression, but at the end of the day, the truth is that our wages are not keeping up with the cost of living. That is magnified recently because of principally reflation, but it was also the case in 2018. There's a statistic that 44% of Oregonians cannot cover their monthly costs. That's a ton of people, and we don't have to live in a society that is structured like that. We can make Oregon better for ourselves. And that's what the Oregon rebate or Measure 118 does. On the one hand, it increases the corporate minimum tax rate after $25 million to 3%, or I'm sorry, by 3%. That generates about, according to the Legislative Revenue Office, about $6.7 billion a year. Let's call it $7 billion a year to make math easy. And then the second thing that the Oregon rebate does is that it provides a rebate to every Oregonian every year using that new revenue after the program pays for itself. So if there's any administrative costs, hold harmless provisions, etc., the new money, the new revenue is what goes back out to our community. And the LRO estimated that to be about $1,600 per person per year. That's a ton of money, and it's particularly good for families, right? Because we wrote in that kids count too. So a family of 4 will get 4 rebates, or about $6,400. I do not know pretty much any of you here, so I do not know in what position you are, but you could imagine that, you know, $1,600 might help. Importantly, also these are some stats from the Legislative Revenue Office. Another effect of the Oregon rebate or Measure 118 is that you can claim the rebate when you file your taxes, and so that's the effect of lowering the typical personal tax return by $2,100 every year. And if you make less than about $40,000 a year, according to the LRO, Measure 118 will basically pay your state taxes for you. So that's pretty fantastic, right? We often hear a lot of folks on the street talking about how they're feeling overtaxed. And so this is another way of doing tax relief for the people. importantly, this money stays in our community. This is money that would normally be going outside of Oregon into the bank accounts of these large corporations, to the bank accounts that they have in like tax shelters in the Cayman Islands and whatnot. What we're doing with Oregon Rebate is bring that money back into our community. And so, for example, in Springfield, when we all get $1,600, we're gonna be about $98 million richer collectively. Like I said, I used to live here. 98 million bucks is a ton of money on Main Street. Right? That's money that's going to not just be good for me, for all of you individually here, but also for our community. In Lane County, it's about $610 million a year. That's a lot of economic activity and prosperity that we are bringing back. Remember, it's the Oregon rebate. This is our money that would otherwise be going to an offshore tax shelter. We are bringing it back into our community. In the last 3 minutes or so that I have, I want to touch on a couple of things that you might hear later. And of course, the conversation is to be continued. But I bet that you're going to hear that that Measure 19 is going to be bad for our local economies or the economies of the state. Like I tried to say before, we don't think so, right? We think that when there's more prosperity and shared prosperity, we all do better. Measure 118 is demand side economics, right? You might prefer supply side economics or trickle down economics, but at the end of the day, people are going to spend this money. And when people spend money, our economies thrive. You might also hear, like from the governor and other folks, that Measure 118 is going to blow a huge hole in the economy, in the state budget. That's a much bigger conversation to be had, but it's important to note that we designed the Oregon rebate to be revenue neutral to the state. The money that comes in pays for the administration of the program and all other incidental costs. And then what's left over is the part that goes back out into rebates. As a little side note, I generally have confidence in our elected officials. I might not agree with them all the time, but again, they're good people doing the best they can at the time, just like me and I think everybody else here. I still in my head do not understand how, if the Oregon rebate is going to bring in $7 billion into Oregon's economy or into the general fund every year. I'm not sure how the legislature cannot patch an alleged hole of $1 billion with $7 billion. Right? So if the general fund is going to have $7 billion more every year, how can there possibly be a $1 billion hole when the program is designed to be revenue neutral? I don't understand it. I have confidence that our legislators will be able to figure that one out. And last, but not least, probably going to hear a bit about the legislative revenue officer report. I introduced it before. I want to point out 3 things about it. First and foremost, the LRO is often wrong, not out of malice, I imagine, but they, like everybody else, is trying to do the best they can. For example, the LRO gets the economic estimate off regularly to the tune of like $5 billion last time. So when we look at the LRO, let's take that with a grain of salt. Number 2, the LRO did not model Measure 118, it modeled some other policy. The LRO report only talks about the cost of the equation, and this in no place ever factor in the economic stimulus of $7 billion a year. We think that's a huge oversight that we need to be aware of. And then third, to us it reads pretty biased. There's a July LRO report, there's a September LRO report, And there's huge differences in what they choose to mention and what they choose to not mention. For example, in the July LRO report, they mentioned the value of the rebate, $1,600, about. In the July, that mention got dropped, right? They also dropped the mention of lowering the personal tax liability of folks, and also forgot to mention the balancing of corporate tax rates. Right now, local owner-operated businesses pay a much higher tax than giant corporations do. We feel that is unfair. And that is something that the LRO pointed out in the July report that they forgot to, or that they chose to not include in the September report. So, sorry, I'm a little bit over. Thank you. And I look forward to continue the conversation soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Antonio. I'd like to offer Preston an opportunity to come up and respond to the opposition to Measure 118.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name is Preston Mann. I'm a political organizer with Oregon Business and Industry. We're a trade group based in Salem. We've got about 1,600 members statewide. 80% of those are small businesses. I'm really excited to be in Lane County today. When I was just a young lad, my first political campaigns were actually run just down the street from here, and I'm a huge Oregon Duck fan. So always excited to be in Lane County and always a good day. Appreciate the Eugene Springfield Chamber of Commerce for hosting us here, and certainly the City Club for putting on this event. But enough about me. Let's get to what you actually want to hear about. Measure 118. We are here today because in about 13 days, you're going to receive a ballot in the mail. And one of the things you're going to be asked to vote on is Measure 118, which you just heard about. So I think it's important to start with just a little bit more background on what this measure actually does. Antonio mentioned it's 4 pages in length. That's true. I encourage you to read it. But in my mind, it raises about 4,000 questions. I feel like I've got a new one every time I read it. But at its most basic level, it proposes a 3% gross receipts tax on the annual sales of goods and services above $25 million. And unlike some of the other gross receipts taxes you might be familiar with, Oregon currently has something called the corporate activity tax, which is a completely different, separate tax and different conversation. But that tax actually has some exceptions and exclusions, and in fact, some deductions, in addition to being a 0.57 rate, which is obviously far lower than the 3% we're talking about here today. Measure 118 has no exemptions or exclusions. That means everything from food, medicine, electricity, insurance, you name it, is subject to the tax at the different points in the supply chain that are above $25 million. And most importantly, when we're talking about gross receipts tax, please understand that we're talking about taxes on sales. That's a far different conversation than a tax on profits or income. This is a tax on sales. When we're talking about taxes on sales, that of course means that you can actually pay this tax when your business is losing money. Think about the economic impact of being forced to pay a massive tax bill when your business is already losing money. And we believe Measure 118 would make Oregon businesses less competitive. By its mere existence, it creates an incentive to move early stages of the supply chain out of Oregon to potentially avoid the pyramiding that we'll talk a little bit about further in this presentation that you see in the supply chain, where you pay that 3% tax at different points of the supply chain. So we're talking about actually putting Oregon-based businesses at a disadvantage to businesses located outside of the state. But I'm kind of burying the lead. At $6.8 billion, this would be the largest tax increase in our state's history, and it's frankly not even close. I mentioned the corporate activity tax earlier. This is several magnitudes larger than the corporate activity tax. And I haven't even mentioned yet how it will reduce revenues in our state's general fund. I'm happy to expand on that a little bit further, but we're talking billions of dollars lost to our state's general funds. The legislative revenue office, which is among the most respected policy offices in the state, has estimated approximately 2,400 businesses are going to pay this tax directly. But what's really important about gross receipts taxes, again, is these are taxes on sales. And unlike a retail sales tax that's placed at the point of sale at a retail location, this applies at every step of the supply chain. And what that ultimately means is you've got this compounding effect on different products, where a product, by the time it starts from the raw material stage to the retail location, has potentially been subject to this tax several times. We'll walk through a couple of examples of that here in a minute. This tax is also fairly complicated for a 4-page measure, and that's evidenced by a number of state reports. The Legislative Revenue Office is just one of them. But if you look through some of those reports, these are nonpartisan, respected sources of information. One of the things that'll jump out at you right away is just the Department of Revenue alone is talking about needing to hire 199 people just to determine eligibility and counteract fraud associated with this measure. And that's just one agency. So this is what I was referencing just a minute ago, and it's part of the reason why over 600 different employers, nonprofit organizations like the Springfield Chamber of Commerce, the Eugene Chamber of Commerce, Travel Lane County have endorsed a no vote on this measure. It's effectively a tax on a tax. As I mentioned, it applies at every step of the supply chain. I'll walk through a specific potential Lane County example here in a second. But you can see here, you've got a product that starts with raw materials, it then moves to a manufacturer, potentially a packaging company, a distributor, and then a retailer, and finally you, the consumer. At every step, it is potentially subject to this 3% tax. The end result there is you paying higher prices for the same goods and services you were previously buying. This is part of what helps explain why economists broadly agree that gross receipts taxes results in higher costs for consumers across the board. And again, there are no exceptions or exclusions to this tax. It applies to everything from food, medicine, electricity, insurance, you name it. This tax on a tax phenomenon is often referred to by economists as pyramiding. So let's walk through a local example. We're in Lane County, timber basket of the world, and it's home to some of the finest renewable wood products in the state. Some of those employers are located just down the street here. This illustration, which I've got copies of in the back of the room, walks through a 2x4. I just recently redid one of my fences. I am not a carpenter. It was not a fun experience. It would be made less fun if I were paying higher lumber prices under a tax like Measure 118. So we start with the forest landowner. The forest landowner sells their timber to a mill. The mill then sells it to the distributor. The distributor then sells it to the retailer, and then the retailer then sells it to me, the guy building his fence. 3, 6, 9, 12. 12% increase in taxes on that one product alone. And of course, there are countless products that are potentially subject to a supply chain just like this one. I challenge you to go home or to look around this room and find a product that doesn't have multiple steps in the supply chain that are potentially subject to this tax. Again, because Measure 118 is a tax on sale and one that does not include any exceptions or exclusions, the end result is higher prices for everyday goods and services we rely on. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I think of the different components the different things and goods and services that I'm purchasing on a regular basis. Insulin, several other different types of medications. I go and see blood experts, regular doctors. Potentially all of those different transactions are subject to this tax. I can tell you, it's already extremely expensive to be a diabetic. I cannot fathom increasing the costs that should for people who are diabetic like myself, or who others that are experiencing a medical condition that would potentially have to pay more under a tax like this. One of the things that I think is really important from the Legislative Revenue Office, and I understand some people have some criticisms of the Legislative Revenue Office, but this is generally agreed upon by economists across the country. Gross receipts taxes are inherently regressive. By that, I mean those who can least afford it are hurt the worst. I'm thinking of the students just down the street who are already struggling to make ends meet and are seniors living on fixed incomes. This measure will increase prices. Economists broadly agree. The Legislative Revenue Office has said it. Oregonians will pay more if a tax like this goes into effect. But to make matters worse, our state and local governments will also pay more because of some of the cost increases associated with this measure. There have been studies that have been done that have said state and local governments would pay separate from the revenue that they're going to lose, which we'll talk about in a second, pay an additional $600 million in tech. $600 million coming out of our schools, our local transportation departments, you name it. I know I'm familiar with conversations at the local government level across the state. There's not $600 million that can come out of those budgets right now. They're already feeling strained. Public safety departments are strained. Our schools are feeling strained. You name it. Our local governments, in addition to consumers, cannot afford this tax. And there's been a couple of mentions of inflation, and of course, this measure would increase inflation. But there's one statistic that always really jumps out to me in this conversation, which is that the cost of living has increased by $11,000 per year for the same goods and services Oregonians were buying in 2021. This measure will make that statistic even worse. I walked you through the 2x4 example earlier. This is a different example. My first job was in a pizza restaurant. Certainly did not have $25 million in sales. We were lucky to do $1,500 in sales per day. But I think of that pizza restaurant often in the different potential ways they would get hit by this measure. Employee health insurance, to-go containers, the pizza boxes, appliances. A lot of pizza ovens are run on natural gas. Certainly there's electricity involved, electronic payment fees. Of course, the products that you're purchasing just to build or just to make the pizzas rather. And then I was a pizza delivery driver. This is going to increase the cost of fuel. When you think about these restaurants, these main street restaurants, they're going to be hammered by a tax like this at so many different points of their operations. There's been a lot of discussion about this already, but Measure 118 is a statutory measure, and what that really means is the legislature can change it in any way they see fit, oftentimes on a simple majority vote. There is simply no guarantee that the $1,600 number that has been thrown around is actually going to make it to you. And in fact, the legislature is going to be highly incentivized to take a look at this. The Legislative Revenue Office, which is the office that our lawmakers look at to determine how revenue policy like this impacts the state budget, has determined the negative impact to our state's general fund, which is what funds our schools, our healthcare services, all of the core services we rely on. We'll see a net loss to the tune of billions of dollars. So if you're a little bit mystified how the largest tax increase in state history can result in a net loss, we can certainly litigate that a little bit further. But the reality is we're talking about a billions of dollar loss to our state's general fund at a time when our state government can least afford it. We are really proud of the Defeat the Costly Tax on Sales campaign of the broad coalition that we've assembled. I personally am not aware of a larger and more diverse political coalition that has come together in our state's history. You can see what some folks are saying about Measure 118 here. Governor Tina Kosak, Measure 118 would punch a hole in the state budget. The McMinnville News Register, it's a half-baked idea that could prove incredibly damaging. Tax Fairness Oregon, a group that traditionally supports corporate tax increases, called the measure a hot mess. There are some quotes from labor unions here, from firefighters who say it will hurt firefighters and other frontline workers. There are a number of really respected individuals and organizations who have already come out against it. Some of those folks are in this room today. Representative John Lively, we appreciate you joining our coalition. You can see labor unions here, from the largest labor union in our state, SEIU, Congresswoman Val Boyle, Speaker of the House Julie Fahey, both the Republican and Democratic leaders in the Oregon legislature, mom and pop grocery shops, the Black Business Association of Oregon. There are over 600 organizations and nonprofits and employers that have joined our coalition. The list grows every day. It's available on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at it. And finally, we really feel like when Oregonians have an opportunity to assess this measure, to assess all of the information that is available, to get the facts about this measure, they'll come to their own conclusions and they'll ultimately decide to vote no. If you want more information about our perspective on this measure, you can visit either one of those links. Encourage you to reach out with questions, and happy to continue the conversation here today.
Thanks, Preston. We'll now open it up for questions from the audience. And since I'm the facilitator, I get to ask the first question.
Glenn, do we do the 5 and 5?
Sorry?
5 minutes and 5 minutes.
Oh, that's right. Never mind, they get 5 more minutes each, I tell you. Be honest.
Len's got some good questions, guys.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Preston, for your presentation as well. I took a few notes, and so instead of being like an organized discussion, I'm just gonna go kind of like bang, 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 by point, if that's all right. Uh, we were super hesitant and made a point to not try to pick winners and losers when it came to drafting the Oregon rebate. We thought that treating everybody the same is the right thing to do, which is why we did not build exceptions or exclusions for my favorite industry here or my favorite industry there. I think that's really important. We also treat the same way. We also treat recipients of the rebate the same way. Everybody gets the rebate. Doesn't really matter. We think that is like the most fair thing to do. There's also one thing I forgot to mention is that then the increase to minimum corporate tax rate impacts similarly corporations based in Oregon and corporations based out of Oregon. So for example, Comcast is based in Philadelphia, right? They're not gonna move out of Oregon anymore, right? They're gonna pay this tax. And you might hear folks talking about incentivizing corporations from moving out of the state. Well, that's not really help them. That's not gonna really help them out either. For example, Nike, it's gonna pay the minimum corporate tax rate regardless of, for the stuff they sell in Oregon, regardless of where they are. And importantly, you only pay the minimum corporate tax rate for the stuff that you sell in the state of Oregon. So whatever profits or sales Nike makes in California, Europe, or China, it doesn't, they're not affected at all by Measure 118. So they could choose to move, hopefully they don't, but if they do, their tax liability under Measure 118 is not going to change as far as the business that they do in the state of Oregon. Preston mentioned that yeah, this new tax rate is going to impact about 2,400 companies. I believe that number is correct. It's important to note that that is about 1.8% of all corporations in the state of Oregon. It's a very small number of corporations. And specifically, it's not a random small number of corporations, but it's the corporations who can most afford to pay taxes and who are paying the least taxes. Remember that the vast majority of corporations in Oregon are owner-operated, like LLCs. Those corporations pay pass-through taxes, which is between 4.75 and 9.9%. This Measure 118 only increases the tax rate after $25 million by 3%. So your first $25 million remains virtually untaxed as it is today, which is an advantage that may or may not be fair for somebody else to discuss. And then the first dollar after $25 million, you have to pay 3 cents on it. We think that's affordable. We think that that is reasonable. And we think that these giant corporations should pay their fair share in the state of Oregon. I also just want to skip a couple of points, then go back to the restaurant example about this like pyramiding of taxes. That to me feels super wonky. And perhaps the best way to think about it is that, or I want to encourage you to think about it, that is the way taxation works in general. Like when I get paid, I pay taxes. And then when I pay for a business or a service, that person also pays taxes. And that goes like that step and step and step. So in the restaurant, right? I go to a pizza shop. Somebody is making pizza, right? And they're paying taxes. Somebody is serving the pizza and they're paying taxes. And then I am consuming the pizza and I am paying taxes. And of course, there's that business owner that is also in there paying taxes as well. So this tax on a tax kind of feels confusing, but really, when you think about it, that's just the way things work. And also, importantly, in my example of the pizza shop, two things are important. Number one, that pizza shop probably does not sell $68,000 worth of pizza every day, which is what you need to do to make you $25 million at the end of the year. That's a ton of money, right? If you've ever worked retail like I have, I've never closed a till with $68,000. Number two, and this is really important, is that every single one of those customers in that restaurant or in that business are going to have an extra $1,600 to spend in that business. Just like the employees of that business are going to have an extra $1,600 or so, and just like the business owner is going to have an extra $1,600 or so, right? So again, we're all going to do better. We're all going to hopefully buy another slice of pizza. My favorite food is true. And yeah, thank you. I'll turn it over.
Preston, your five minutes.
Thank you. I'll be really brief this time. The things I really want you to remember today is there's going to be all sorts of conversations about this measure over the next 33 days between now and election day. But please remember that this is a tax on sales, not profits. It is a tax on a tax on a tax. That pyramiding can go on for as long as that supply chain is involved. That is not, in fact, the way things work today. I agree that all of the taxes that Antonio just mentioned do exist today. This tax does not. It would be a new tax and one that would apply potentially at every step of the supply chain. Antonio's right. Most of those pizza restaurants are not doing $25 million in sales. But to my point earlier, they're buying products from some of the businesses that do $25 million in sales. And when they're buying those products, they're probably going to pay higher prices as a result of it. And if they're paying higher prices, you probably are paying a higher price for that slice of pizza. And lastly, as our governor has said, as economists have said, this is going to punch a hole in our state's budget to the tune of billions of dollars. It's going to punch a hole in local government's budgets, and it's going to increase prices for consumers at a time when we can least afford it. Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. Well, now I'll get to ask. And then we'll go to other questions. We'll go on. Yeah. The question I have is, in July, the National Bureau of Economic Research published a report which discussed a number of different measures like this taxation that was redistributed. Without going into the substance of what they said, fear of influencing, could each of you respond what you know about other jurisdictions that are experimenting with this sort of approach and how they have, what the result has been?
And can I have you guys sit in the chair
Sure.
just for the camera?
So I am not familiar with that report. However, I think that the policy that is closest to Measure 118 that's currently in effect is the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend. That's been going on for about 42 years. And if you're not familiar, everybody in Alaska gets about, they call it their dividend. It's about between $1,000 and $2,000 every year. It floats up and down, just like the Oregon rebate will. And it was just announced that, in fact, this year, as a fun coincidence, that permanent fund dividend is going to be about $1,700 per person. Good thing about Alaska is that that's been studied like for 40 years, right? And number one, it's a super popular policy in the state. Like whenever it's polled, people love it. Number two, it makes Alaska one of the most, the least unequal states when it comes to income. I mean that the gap between the rich and the poor is narrower, is in Alaska, is narrower than in most other US states. And three, it's been studied at length. What do people use the money on? One thing happens from a business community perspective. When the rebates are announced, all the stores in Alaska not rebates, they call them dividends, forgive me. When the dividends are announced and they go out, all the businesses there throw sales, and it's like, spend your dividend here, right? Like furniture stores, whatever. And the one category that often that sees the most noticeable spike in expenditure is actually kids' clothing. The dividends go out right before in the fall up there, and so families use that money to basically buy coats for their kids. Right? It is just a thing that's been working super well in Alaska for 40 years. We should probably have something similar.
Preston?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Lynn. I'm not familiar with the study you mentioned. I am familiar with the Legislative Revenue Office report that I mentioned a couple of times, which says that Measure 118 would dampen income, it would result in fewer jobs, and it would result in higher prices. Like the Alaska program comes up from time to time. I would encourage you to go read the Oregonian's editorial in opposition to Measure 118 or to watch the video where the Alaska program was discussed relative to Measure 118, but the takeaway here is that's a radically different program. The reality here is this is a first of its kind experiment. It's an experiment funded by out-of-state interests, and I don't think Oregonians are going to support it at the end of the day.
Thank you. Preston?
Yeah, Antonio, I appreciate what you try to do, but two things. Essentially, if everybody gets the rebate, that's a regressive tax. Because you can give it to me, but I probably don't deserve it. Second.
Is there a question there?
Huh?
Is there a question?
Yeah, it essentially, it's a regressive tax, right? And because it gives out to everybody same amount instead of progressive, where you would, if you have higher income, you're gonna get less of a rebate. The other thing is,
Excuse me, do you have a question? We're trying to
okay, I
ask
just
questions
said,
of
our
our presenters.
I'm sorry, but it's a regressive tax, and
If I may, so there's a concept of the marginal value of money. And so the Measure 118 is extremely progressive. So marginal value of money means that if you're a millionaire and you get $1,600, you don't really notice. But if you're a regular person, it makes a huge difference. So the impact of the rebate is much, much bigger for regular folks.
but that's why we give smaller rebates to upper income.
And so we did the math, right? And so it's really a matter of choice. And goes back to picking the winners and losers, right? If we exclude the top 1% of earners in the state of Oregon, that only increases the size of the rebate for everybody else by $16. The amount of work that it would be to exclude that top 1% to make everybody's rebate $16 bigger just does not feel like it's worth it to us. And I have the table here, forgive me, I'm gonna sneak a look. And so even if we went all the way down and excluded the top tax rate in the state of Oregon, and that's about 100,000 folks, that only increases the value of the rebate by about $39 per person. So why make the Department of Revenue do that additional work when really it's not gonna make that big a difference? And also, we believe as a value that we all are equally deserving of the good things in society, like access to public schools, public libraries, etc. And even yourself, sir, you do deserve it. Even if you do not need it, I'm sure you can find a way to donate it to somebody or do something creative with the money. Thank you.
Preston?
But there's a reason economists almost universally agree that gross receipts taxes are in fact regressive. Again, this is a tax on sales, not profits. They increase prices and they increase prices for those that can least afford it. So I would encourage you to review the economic literature that is out there on gross receipts taxes and recognize that this would be among the highest gross receipts taxes in the country. It has no exemptions or exclusions. And at the end of the day, it is regressive. The Nonpartisan Legislative Revenue Office confirms that. Antonio doesn't apparently like that report. There are plenty of other economists that assert that as well.
Thank you. Please, a question.
Yes, I'll ask a question. Thank you both for being here. My question is about, I'm curious about the rebate being taxable. So every man, woman, and child that's been in the state of Oregon for 200 days would receive this. I'm curious, is it it's not taxable at the state level, but it is the federal level? And then so, like a toddler doesn't pay taxes, and so would they have to then file a tax return, or I'm just kind of curious how that would work?
Thank you. So, maybe I spoke about that too quickly. The parents or the guardian of minors independence get the rebate. And so the parents would report that as income if they have to. There's two ways to get the rebate. One, if you file it, if you file for it on your taxes and you apply it to your tax liability in the state of Oregon, it's a refundable tax credit. And so it will not be taxable at the federal level. If on the other hand, you can also claim the rebate before or after you file your taxes. Say you really need the money in March, or say you want to wait until November. Then in that case, it is possible that it will be taxable at the federal level because it will be just directly cashed to you. Does that answer your question?
I believe the answer to your question is yes, this is going to be treated as income. You are going to owe a federal tax bill for the amount of money that you receive here. I think this is a question that's overlooked in the broader discussion of the impact of this measure. But the reality is I think you're going to see some people with a surprise tax bill if this measure were come to pass, and they're not going to be very excited about that.
Thank you. Next,
I've got a couple online, so I'll start with the first one. And it's asking if you can clarify who you're talking about when you say The Economists. Can you actually name who those folks are?
Sure. I mean, starting with the Nonpartisan Legislative Revenue Office, which is respected by not just lawmakers, but by pretty much everybody who in fact interacts with government affairs in Oregon and public policy. That is the go-to source for understanding how Oregon tax policy is going to impact Oregon. But the names escape me off the top of my head. I would encourage you to Google gross receipts tax regressive. You're going to find a number of search results. I'm certainly happy to provide those to you after the fact if you'd like.
Jenna, do you have any economists to identify?
Well, I want to touch on, I don't have a beef with the LRO. I think that they're fine, but they're not infallible, right? So the errors in their estimates lead to the kicker. It seems like those errors are getting bigger and more frequent. So it's something to note. And then also there's like the manner in which they are expressing their findings. I think it's important for folks to put a grain of salt on that. For example, Preston mentioned before that the LRO mentions that inflation is going to go up by 1.3%. That's a number from the LRO report, but importantly, they say that in kind of like the summary at the top, but then on page 17, you can actually read that is 1.3% by the year 2030. Now that's a super different number, right? We've done the math. Even if inflation goes up by 1.3%, you as an individual are still going to be up. Because the estimate cost of that would be like $950. You're gonna get $1,600. You're gonna be up. You should be fine. But so it's important to sort of like be critical about the stuff that we read.
Can I respond to that real quickly? So just a point of clarification, the kicker forecasts are not conducted by the Legislative Revenue Office. It's conducted by the Office of Economic Analysis. That's a completely separate office, so it has no interplay to this conversation. But Antonio's right, the Legislative Revenue Office is incomplete on some level. LRO was not able to calculate the pyramiding concept that we talked about earlier, and that's obviously has some pretty enormous ramifications for this discussion. So, yeah, I think there are some key pieces of information that are missing. I think those pieces of information are actually dramatically worse for our economy, in addition to the dampening of wages and income that's already assessed in your report.
Paige, you have another online question?
I do, and it actually kind of ties to what they were talking about. So
Okay.
I want to ask that now. Do the proponents agree that the rebate will contribute to inflation based on the LRO calculation, or do you have an alternative view of the inflationary impact?
Like I just said, I think that 1.3% by 2030 is like 0.2% year over year. Kroger and Myers just admitted in federal court in Portland that they price gouged us on essential food above and beyond inflation. I think that it's important that we assign responsibility to the correct party, right? If 53% of the price increase that we've seen recently was due to just basically corporate greed and greedflation. That is a much bigger deal than the 0.26% inflation that may or may not happen. Importantly, folks, we can use our rebates and shop local in small local businesses that are not going to have to pay this higher 3% tax and insulate ourselves from just corporate greed by giant multinational corporations.
Preston?
It doesn't seem like there's any disagreement. Measure 118 is going to increase inflation, and I'll remind you again that Oregonians are paying $11,000 more today than they were for the same goods and services just a couple of years ago. This is going to increase prices. We all apparently agree on that.
Tom?
I think this is for Preston. Punching a hole in the state budget, is that because goods and services will cost more for the state, or there's somehow some effect on the state's revenue gathering?
There's a complicated interplay with the feature of state tax policy known as the corporate kicker. But ultimately, the net loss modeled by LRO is $1.8 billion for the upcoming biennium. That almost doubles for the following biennium. So there is an actual net loss in terms of raw dollars. And then there's the separate conversation about increased costs to state and local governments. That's the $600 million number I referenced.
And that's because the 3% is written off.
That's because they're going to be paying higher prices for everyday goods and services that government purchases as well.
Antonio?
Yeah, as I read, I see something differently. I think that there's a debate as to, so the Oregon rebate Measure 118 is designed to be very neutral to the state, and some folks in the LRO, they're modeling as like administration costs that are not covered by the program. Then we think it's a misread of the text of the initiative, and importantly, we have a way to address that in after November. So importantly, the corporations will start paying the higher taxes in January 1, 2025, giant corporations. Then the rebates only go out in 2026. So we have a full calendar year and a long session to make sure that Measure 118 is implemented correctly. Just to say, no giant hole in the budget. Because remember, there's going to be $7 billion more to pay for administration of the program and associated costs. So Preston mentioned that the Department of Revenue, for example, is talking about bringing in 189 new folks to work on this program. I think that's a little bit inflated. The state of Oregon already sends out kicker checks to every Oregonian taxpayer every year. It doesn't strike us as realistic to need 200 people more to just increase the value of that yearly kicker by $1,600 per capita, right? There might be a phenomenon of maybe some departmental directors seeing this program, coming down the pipe and thinking, okay, maybe we can pad our numbers here a bit. And again, that's something that will be discussed during the long session and during implementation. So there should really be, the state should be revenue neutral, and the economic stimulus effect of the rebates are going to, down the line, lead to increased tax revenues for the state, right? If we're all spending $7 billion more a year or so, those are going to turn into tax receipts, et cetera, et cetera. The general fund's gonna be fine.
We have actually reached 1 o'clock, but I'm gonna continue for a couple of questions if we can. You have a question?
Yeah,
Did we?
while the wood products industry is obvious to us, agriculture in general is a low margin business. I mean, really low margin. And what studies have been done on the impact of our ranches and our farms in Oregon if this is implemented?
You're absolutely right. Agriculture is a low margin industry. In fact, sometimes it's a no margin industry. There are many years where our farmers and ranchers are actually losing money due to a variety of different reasons. So I'm not aware of a specific analysis off the top of my head. But I think of our farmers and ranchers, whether they're earning money that year or losing money, or whether they have $25 million of sales or they're below that number. The reality is they're buying fuel, they're buying fertilizer, they're certainly purchasing electricity, all the other products that go into modern day farming and ranching, all of which are going to go up in price under a tax like this.
Antonio?
And I do not know exactly what kind of business you're talking about, but I know, and I wish I had a copy of it. In the full text, it's very clear that the section of the minimum corporate tax rate does not apply to certain kinds of agricultural businesses and co-ops. So you have to see where you are, where your corporation is, to see if you fit in or not. And of course, it's after $25 million.
Well, think about it though.
We move on. We have one more question here.
Yeah, I will admit to not reading the Legislative Revenue Office's report, so I would like to better understand what the interaction between the corporate kicker and this that was referred to is, and then I'm wondering if that is the thing that the proponents believe they have a fix to, and if so, what exactly that fix would be.
Okay, right. So the LRO is pretty clear that in this current biennium, the corporate kicker is going to increase, and so there's going to be more money for public ed in the state for this biennium is going to end in 2025. Going down the line, this is something that we disagree, because the corporate kicker is treated by a percentage above the expected corporate taxes. The fact that big corporations are going to be paying more in taxes, if that margin of error is the same, then the benefit of the corporate kicker is going to be bigger and bigger. And this is another thing that is kind of subtle, but it's really important. Right now, the 64% of the general fund is paid for by personal taxes. Then the next big chunk is lottery revenue, lottery taxes, which is us buying lottery tickets. And then the third piece is corporate taxes. And what Measure 118 does is that it kind of like flips that around and makes corporations pay the bigger share of the general fund, which we think it is more fair than currently, like everyday people like paying for the state of Oregon, because corporations also benefit from all the good things that the state provides, but from roads all the way up.
Preston?
This is part of the reason I said it's a 4-page measure that inspires 4,000 questions. I'm certainly happy to provide you with a copy of the Legislative Revenue Office report. It's a complicated interplay in our tax policy, and I don't want to misspeak. But it's interesting. We're already talking about fixing something that hasn't even passed yet. It makes me nervous when a ballot measure hasn't even passed, and we're talking about needing potential adjustments to it. And remember, this tax begins on January 1, 2025. So apparently we're talking about a special session to potentially fix something that passes in November. And as it relates to the corporate kicker, please understand that the corporate kicker funds currently go to fund our schools. So this is a very high stakes conversation when we're talking about the corporate kicker, and the potential consequences here are enormous.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody. It is well past 1. I'm gonna have to bring an end to this. But for those of you who want to continue the conversation, tomorrow at the Eugene City Club, they will also be having a program on Measure 118. And as members of the Springfield City Club, you are entitled to go to a Eugene City Club meeting without charge as if you were a member. So if you continue to be interested, show up tomorrow at 12 noon. Let me thank both Preston and
Where will that meeting be tomorrow?
oh, at the Wow Hall, yes. And you can come back here, come back to Roaring Rapids Pizza in 2 weeks for our next program. Watch your email to figure out exactly what that's gonna be. Thank you very much.